marked by the wild, the natural world and our relationship to it. In the theater of Canada's Algonquin Park, the theme plays on.
I think it's good to get away from the city sometimes and see what the wilderness is like and all the forests and lakes.
When I come to Algonquin Park, it's all like a dream. It takes away from reality. There's no problems, there's no worries, there's no hustle and bustle of the city. It's just all a fantasy.
Everyone here, they've come from all over the world, and they've just gathered here, but you can't see any differences.
When I first came to Algonquin in 1939, I had no idea of what it was going to be like or how big a place it was. But I knew that I loved the atmosphere, seeing what great country it was and how remote and how beautiful, and enjoying all of the wildlife that we saw along the way. And it became a sort of obsession with me, I guess, to come back every year.
People come to the park for different reasons. Some of them, and I think this is true of many of the leaseholders, come because they started out here as canoe trippers or campers at one of the children's camps, but they have somehow been touched by the magic of this place.
I have to get away about once every 3 months or something, maybe all by myself, to experience the sunset, the fogs, the snowstorms, a complete different feeling and closeness to whatever that thing you're close to. That's a personal experience, I guess, that everybody has.
And it's a kind of like an ideal environment for people to be in, and how close we are to nature, and all the wants in our lives aren't important anymore. It's really just having fun and having a good time and appreciating other people.
They are countless, and here are but a few of them. Stories, that is, Algonquin stories. Age-old granite, lakes, rivers, and bush. The Canadian Shield, half of the landmass of Canada, inextricably imprinted on the population's psyche. From a mystical people of lake and forest, the Algonquin, here 4,000 years ago, we adopted the canoe, and with it, passage to the soul of the land. A pilot for the Ministry of Natural Resources, this is Gord Pearson's daily arena. In North America, mid to late last century, as a reaction to the growth of cities and industry, a park movement began. In Canada's province of Ontario, concentration of population to the south, where the land tamed easier, led to the creation of Algonquin Park, in a then near North Hinterland. Today, 7,600 square kilometers, 4,500 square miles in territory, plays host to close to 1 million visitors a year. They come from around the globe to experience wilderness, the nirvana of a new millennia. The Petawawa, Bonachère, Madawaska, Magnetawan. Here are the headwaters of rivers of legend. Arriving in its first year, 1893, Algonquin's incoming superintendent, Peter Thompson, chose a site at Canoe Lake as park headquarters. Out to explore the territory, one of his newly assigned rangers to accompany him would keep a journal. His name, Stephen Waters.
Saturday, up at daybreak. Had breakfast and was off at 6 o'clock. Reached T Falls at 2. It began to rain and continued all afternoon and night. Arrived at headquarters at 4. Wet, cold.
I charge you 1 day for today until 9.
Right.
See, this runs on a calendar basis.
Right.
You pay $15.95 till today at 9 o'clock.
Right, 9 p.m.
9 p.m. You have it from 2 until 2.
Those that visit for the first time join a population of people who have long been associated with Algonquin.
So in the future, when you're putting the boat in the water, you just grab it from the gunnels here. Simply just go down like that.
2,500 lakes offer a trial ground where people from urban environments can relearn the lessons of the natural world, a need fostered by our continuing alienation from it.
Just put the paddle in and lean forward as you pull down. It's very simple. And then use your body. You're not using your arms like this, you're using your body.
The way of the canoe is the way of the wilderness and of freedom almost forgotten. By 1900, almost half of North Americans were living in cities. Wilderness appreciation became part of a social movement, with church and youth groups establishing outdoor education centers. In Algonquin, remaining from that era, is Taylor Staton Camp.
My dad was the founder of the camp in 1921. He started coming up to Algonquin and this lake in 1912 and took a lease on a little island in the lake on the other side. And there were 36 campers, about a dozen staff, and my dad was in charge. Everybody was here for 2 months. We came in a train, and it was a very remote area in those days. The influence of the Indians in the early camping days was really tremendous. Their way of life and their philosophy of life, their group living, and the democratic way that they handled things was the theme of early children's camps. And Ernest Thompson Seton was a very good friend of my dad's and introduced the whole philosophy into our camps, as he did in many camps throughout North America.
Sunday. Left at 7. Short portages on small lakes. Met canoe with 4 men in it. Found out afterwards they were agents for an American lumber firm. Reached Madawaska at 9. Stopped at camp an hour to have baked biscuits. They were all at work, although it was Sunday. Wilson went into shanty to order supper and is offended. They gave us a poor supper. 1.5 paddle to headquarters. Wind south.
Waters met many a lumberman. For decades prior to the birth of the park and continuing, the Highland region would yield a motherlode, square timber for the British Navy, sawn lumber to build the American West. This was a time when over half of the male workforce in Canada spent winters in the bush hurling down the pine. On the Sabbath, often they told stories, danced, and they sang.
Some of my very best friends were lumbermen who, during the summer, came and worked here as carpenters and helpers, and in the kitchen. Our chef for 35 years was a chef from the lumber camps, just a tremendous person. So I have a deep respect for the people that have passed on and but made their tremendous contribution.
She is sometimes known as the Lady of the Looms, Esther Kaiser.
Well, I first came to Algonquin Park when I was 12 years old at the suggestion of a friend of my father's who had a place up here. And I first stayed at Northway Lodge. In this case is camp on Cache Lake. That summer, I was fortunate enough to be selected to go on a canoe trip. And I simply loved it. I just fell in love with the park, and I decided that this was the place where I wanted to spend as much time as possible. My impression, I think, was one of utter freedom. And I still have that feeling. The lakes and the trees and the weather, all, you just feel as if nothing matters. I began to, in later years, become interested in a little more scientifically in what there is in the woods. And I began to keep loon records for the park naturalist. Somehow or other, I felt when I was out on the trail that I was doing what I was supposed to do.
Within a year of Algonquin's incorporation, loggers turned to the iron horse for hauling their wood. John Rudolphus J.R. Booth, whose timber operation in its time was the largest in the world, pioneered the first rail line. His vision of Algonquin, shared by others, as a managed forest reserve and park, had been influential to its being. By World War I, the line was the busiest in the country, carrying lumber, troops, grain, and soon an era of vacationers.
We usually stayed overnight at Aurelia, and then the next morning we would try to get to Scotia Junction by 10 o'clock because that's when the train left. And we would come in by train to Cache Lake. The train ran into the park 3 days a week and out of the park 3 days a week, so it was a question of timing to some extent. Most of the people coming in on the train were people who were headed for Nominee, Minising, or Highland Inn. The ladies would sit on the porch and play cards, and the men would fish. But I really didn't have any association with them. There were also people coming to Northway Lodge, and so there would be people coming to the camps. But also that train was a big boost for canoeists, because I remember several times taking the train from Cache Lake to Bruley Lake and riding in the baggage car with our canoe and gear, and then getting out at Bruley Lake and starting our trip there. That was fun too.
Cy Klein, who originates from New York State, came to know Algonquin as an employee of one of the lodges, born in the age when curative holidays would last a summer.
Well, Minising was built by the Grand Trunk Railroad back in 1913, along with its sister camp, Nominagan on Smoke Lake. And they were made out of white cedar logs with the bark on. Very impressive buildings. There was a main lodge which had a long porch across the front and down two sides, and there were 6 individual lodges, each of which had a big living room and a cathedral ceiling. All these buildings had big stone fireplaces, and they were actually the source of heat for the hot water. There was a coil through the back of the fireplace that heated hot water, and we'd go build fires every morning to be sure that when the guests got up that they'd have hot water for washing. Yeah, at the time Minising was operating, the Algonquin Hotel at Joe Lake was also operating. The Hotel Algonquin was a rather plain wooden structure that had fewer of the niceties, I would say, than Minising. Of course, the Highland Inn was operating at that time. The railroad came right up to the front door practically. And they attracted a lot of people, maybe people who were a little more into the social end of vacationing rather than looking for quite as remote a spot. But it was a nice, well-run hotel, and a lot of people enjoyed it. And of course, right across the bay from there was Bartlett Lodge, which was accessible only by water. That too was a nice location, but once again, maybe a little more social.
Wilderness can be appreciated only with contrast, and solitude understood when we have been without it. Sigurd Olsen. The movement of a canoe is like a reed in the wind. Silence is a part of it.
April 1. Thompson stole the blankets for the night. Slept rather cold. Fitzgerald kicking. Monday, April 2nd. Done nothing. Tuesday, April 3rd. Same as yesterday.
Camp builds your personality. It makes you stronger, and it makes you so much a better person because of all the things you learn here. You learn to work with others, and you learn to cope with things.
I think another thing is you're kind of, the first a couple of nights you're not used to no electricity and you have the comforts of home, so you say, well, I guess we better start roughing it. This isn't fun, and everything like that. But then you get used to it, and when it's time to leave, you just don't want to leave it. And when you get home, you're kind of thinking, why do we have to have a light bulb? We don't really need one. And it's just kind of great to be here.
Especially Taylor Staton is roughing it, because I've heard of other camps that have light bulbs and bathrooms in the same cabin, and showers.
And showers.
And a tap.
And
and toilet paper.
Wallpaper.
I would think the people that will come here and spend a lot of time together in the park will eventually fall into a routine. I'm thinking specifically of tripping in the park. Will fall into a routine where a lot of the excess in terms of personalities and putting on an aura of who you are and what you pretend to be, or all that, will slowly disintegrate on canoe trip. And you really come to the essential of your personality, and it becomes easier to get to know people.
May 12th. Went to depot with Thompson after apple trees and more stock. Thompson now superintendent. A man named Simpson, chief ranger. May 15. Went to look for a portage. Found one at McIntosh Lake, located 2 families of beaver. The chief ranger arrived. A queer stick.
One day, please.
I think the wilderness is more important to people who have the stresses of the city. I do see people come here with all the accoutrements of the city, and yet if they're here long enough, the need for things drops away.
One of the real values of Algonquin Park is that it exists 2.5 hours from Toronto. I mean, we could have wilderness, which would be 6-10 hours away, but it wouldn't get nearly as utilized.
You are in the middle. You're not in the middle.
I really feel that the more crowded our cities are and the more our population grows, the more we need places like Algonquin Park.
We haven't canoed an awful lot, so we're, looking for something that would be very stable and very safe.
Okay, well, you're just coming for the day, so what I might recommend is that you see those big colorful canoes out there?
In May of 1912, the arrival at Canoe Lake of one man would prompt a movement that would for all time enunciate the touch of the wild. Tom Thompson, angler, canoeist, and painter, embraced the park as home. Basing himself at Mowat Lodge, a former lumber company boarding house, the next 5 years saw Thompson render the landscape into sketches and canvases. He inspired colleagues Fred Varley, A.Y. Jackson, and Arthur Lismer to join him. In his work, Thompson burst free from an ordinary past, painting with heat that went to the edge, separating the figurative from the abstract. Thompson's peers would go on to form the Group of Seven, proclaiming the Canadian Shield to the world, but he would not be one of them. On July 16, 1917, Thompson's body was found in Canoe Lake, his promise cut short by an apparent drowning. Although speculation about his death remains in local lore, Tom Thompson lives as the one who gave voice to Algonquin.
the lake is always changing, and you're never really too sure, you know, what lies beyond, and you're never really too sure what lies within the lake. I've looked out at this lake hundreds and hundreds of times since I've been up here, and never once has it been the same. And never once has it been completely rainy, or the day, it has never been just a rainy day. And even when it does rain, it's still beautiful. I mean, the lake looks fantastic. And
you see the rain coming, you anticipate it, it goes away, you're relieved that it's gone away and that you'll be able to pull into your campsite and not be worried about the rain. Here you have to turn around and see that the storm is approaching. You become a lot more aware.
Now I see the secret of making the best person. It is to grow in the open air and eat and sleep with the earth. Walt Whitman. The era following the First War would see the automobile take over as the means for the average city dweller to take in a wilderness weekend or summer holiday. They paved the Highway to Heaven, a government relief program during the Depression of the 30s that saw the construction of roads multiply by 4, led to the creation of the anomaly of nature parkways. Highway 60 leading into Algonquin Park would create a corridor in the southern section which separated it from the more remote north. Unchanged, the power of the natural world on the human condition.
When the road was put through the park in 1935, I think, leases were open. In fact, the park encouraged people to take leases. And my brother and I thought that it would be good to do this, so we took a lease out together at first, and then the next year we each had a separate lease. When we first came to our lease, the lake shore was so clogged with logs and floating sticks and things we could hardly get our canoe ashore. And then there was so much underbrush and so much growth we could hardly find a place to put a tent. My idea was for a place to hold my canoe trip equipment. I didn't think of it as a home particularly. We brought all the tools and all the nails and the roofing paper and everything down by canoe from the Smoke Lake landing. And by making a sort of a raft out of the lumber and putting things like, well, the heating stove on top of the lumber, we were able to tow these things down. And one time I remember I made the mistake of not tying the two canoes together, and they started drifting apart and the lumber started to slide into the lake, but we managed to get it all.
Back in the days after the Second World War, most of the people were coming from areas that were much unlike this. A lot of people had been in the war and were back and looking for a chance to get away from the rush of life and to get into an environment that was more relaxed. They were average people. They weren't the wealthy people who came up here. There weren't at that time a lot of lodges that you could get to reasonably easily, but were still buried in the wilderness to the extent that Minising was. So you had people who were a little more adventuresome, who wanted to get back to have a somewhat of a wilderness type experience. We had canoeing and boating and sailing and fishing, hiking.
If we can somehow retain places where we can always sense the mystery of the unknown, our losses will be riches. Sigurd Olsen.
Wednesday, September 27. Bright and clear again. Heard the wolves howling across the lake. Well, started to fix an old lumber camp for the rangers to stay in. Thursday, put up new stove. Thompson kicking. Says it's not the stove he ordered. Very stormy. South wind.
I came back year after year in different capacities as a canoe trip counselor for Northway Lodge. And also I started out on my own organizing and conducting canoe trips in the days when women didn't do those things. And I would take groups for a two-week trip, and then I'd come back and be here a day or so, and then I'd take another 2-week trip out. So most of my early days were spent on the trail throughout the park. And I have visited most of the big lakes in the park and most of the popular canoe routes.
Every time I paddle, I think maybe this is something like a Zen experience. There's tremendous serenity in that motion. It's not as forceful as other sports. It's not a difficult motion, I don't find. And you can just let your mind float when you're paddling. And as I say, it brings tremendous serenity. And then there are times when the activity of canoeing becomes very intense. A headwind or some rapids, go through some obstacles or whatnot, a beaver dam. There are a lot of variations to it.
We didn't even have sleeping bags. We used Hudson Bay blankets. In those days, it was common practice to cut boughs and make a bough bed. We didn't have the freeze-dried food. The one thing that fed us was fish, and we never had any trouble catching fish. I loved everything about it, even the hard work. I loved the little rivers. I loved the beautiful big lakes. I think my favorite lake is white trout. And I loved the evening campfires.
Dance with your canoe. A dance as graceful as any mating ritual in the world. When the music ends, you'll be wearing a faint secret smile, and you will understand the mystic of the solo canoe. Author unknown.
Jasper Brown. Jeffries. Here. Brown. Weiser-Becky.
Because of camping, I decided to become a teacher because I grew up in this environment with people. And I guess the greatest thrill that I get is seeing other people achieve and other people learn and other people accomplish things. And when I come to camp, I see so much of that. I see so much growth and development over a very short period of time.
Okay, gentlemen, 1 minute. Would all the boats now get in the water? All boats in the water. Get set. Go!
Check that out. Check that out. Check that out.
The most important thing I've learned from camp is not to give up anything. Like not to quit or like just not to quit. That's I think one of the philosophies of the camp, and I think that's the most important thing.
Tuesday. Started for home. Reached quite a distance up the Nipissing. Had to chase a moose out of the river to get past. Camped in a shanty for the night.
Another person that I knew quite well was Charlie Musclow. And he built a lodge and several outbuildings, and their first customers in their restaurant were the road gang that was building the road into the park. But Charlie used to tell me, in all seriousness, some things such as the loons spend the winter under the ice. And if I would kind of question that, he'd say, well, they always appear as soon as the ice goes out, and they're always here up until the ice forms. So, of course, it's true. Those early bush people, they were rough and ready in their way, but they really respected and appreciated the bush.
Today, societies situated at distances from the rural world most often perceive nature as an untrammeled refuge.
Beautiful day for a boat ride.
The fact remains that humans have been associated with the park for at least 4,500 years and have been an increasingly major factor in the region's ecology for the last century and a half. Isolated from the soil, we attempt to regain our original covenant, a primeval bond with it, as outdoor recreation and education become a mass phenomena. Written into the story of Algonquin is the history of social evolution, the natural world and our relationship to it.
A lot of the lodges had repeat business every year for a long time, but then things changed and the society became more mobile and the roads were extended and more places were available. People didn't take long family vacations, so the lodges that catered to family vacations had to either change the way they did business or go out of business. Menacing was literally forced out of business by the policy of the ministry when they refused to renew the lease. All of the commercial establishments in the park were on year-to-year leases. And when they developed a policy of not making any more leases available for cottages in 1954, they also decided to phase out some of the lodges.
I have become certainly a lot more environmentally aware, more interest in geography, nature. When I travel now, I will often look out and think, oh, would this be paddleable? Would this be an interesting tripping area? I still have that sense that I can come across this country in a canoe. As long as there's some water, I can make my way through it. And that's amazing in terms of our country. There's so much water, and I know that I have access to it. And that all originated from my experience in the park.
The mark of the wild. Tensions that exist surrounding future use of our parks, development versus preservation, whether or not they should be interpreted as living museums, will continue. But the truth is, there are millions of people alive today who hold precious memories of Algonquin, a small piece of the great Canadian outback. Age-old granite, lakes, rivers, and bush. With each gentle stroke, we journey through it and anxiously hold for the next bend, the still bay, the campfire, and stories at the close of day.
My experience at Menacing gave me a lesson in learning about how to do things with my hands and how to be effective in a lot of different ways in my life that I never would have been able to if it hadn't been for that experience. By being involved at Menacing and just the opportunity to live in this environment all of my adult life has been probably the greatest thing that I could point to that has affected me and my life and the life of my family.
Spending time in Algonquin Park has given me, I think, a unique perspective on life, I guess. Well, first of all, your connection with the wilderness and your connection with grassroots living.
Well, I think it's when you're in the city, you don't really think about it, and sometimes you start destroying it without knowing it. And I think when you come up here, you can see that this could be all gone, and you don't want that to happen.
I don't think they should change Algonquin Park because, just like she said, it'll be like Toronto or one of those big places, and it'll be ruined and really bad for the environment.
It helps you mellow out. Like it lets you relax, and when you come back to the city, you're a lot more peaceful, and then it helps you with your life. Like, just think about being at camp and being really laid back.
The park, I believe, is a sacred place. It's just a place for feeling self-confident, feeling strong, feeling healthy, and feeling close to the spirit. I feel it's an invaluable resource for Canadians and people from other countries too.
And it's such a beautiful place. I mean, every summer I sit on the porch right out here and I tell myself, Mike, you've got to come back next year.
Wednesday, met Fraser and party going out. Stayed overnight. O'Leary snored like a steam calliope. Fine day, south wind. Stephen Waters, Ranger, Algonquin Park, 1893.